Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to understand Sharpe ratio and how we use it to assess the risk of any portfolio. Okay, so let's read over here. The Sharpe ratio compares the return of an investment with its risk. Now I will give you an example. Let us say that I invest in a mutual fund and I generated 20% return. Okay, by investing in a mutual fund, okay, in a mutual fund scheme basically, okay, and I would have generated a 5% return if I invested in a risk free return, in a risk free security. So risk free securities are those securities which do not offer any risk and they give you a fixed return, like treasury bills, government bonds, etc. Okay, so I got a 20% return if when I invested my money in a mutual fund scheme. I would have got 5% return if I generated in a risk free return. So the total extra return that I generated is what? 20% minus 5%, correct? So that is what? 15%. So that means I generated 15% extra return by investing in a mutual fund. But is that it? No. For this extra return that I generated, I took some extra risk. Correct? If I take risk, then only I'll get higher returns. Okay. So for that extra risk that I have taken, that is why I got higher returns to compensate for it. Now let us suppose that I took 3 units of risk. I took 3 units risk. Now, this is the total return that I generated. If I divide this by the total units of risk that I've taken, what I will get is that per unit risk, how much returns I generated. Okay, so here it is 5%. This means what? For the per unit risk that I took 3 units risk and I generated an extra return of 15%, which means per unit risk, I generated 5% return. Okay, now in my last video I explained to you how we calculate risk of a mutual fund scheme, and risk of a mutual fund scheme is nothing but the standard deviation, right? So this 3% is 3 units is nothing but 3%. This 3% is the standard deviation in the mutual fund. If you don't know what is standard deviation and how it is calculated in mutual fund, please watch my previous video. Okay, now this thing that I did, that I calculated per unit how much return I generated. This is nothing but Sharpe ratio. Okay. Now, as absolute value, Sharpe ratio will not tell you anything. Sharpe ratio is useful when you're comparing it. So, understand this. If I say that for mutual fund A and mutual fund B, let us say, so the return that I generated for mutual fund A, mutual fund B, let us say this is 20% and this is 24%. Risk free return is the same. Risk free return, let's say the risk free return is 4%, 4%. Okay. Now, standard deviation for mutual fund A, standard deviation is nothing but risk. Exactly. So, standard deviation, let's say for mutual fund is 5%, and for mutual fund B it is let's say 10%. Okay, so by this you can tell me that mutual fund B is a much riskier scheme, that mutual fund B is a much riskier scheme. Correct. Now if I try to calculate the Sharpe ratio, what is Sharpe ratio? How do we calculate Sharpe ratio? Please have a look at the formula once. Expected return means the average return that a portfolio generated in the past few years. If you don't know this concept, please watch my previous video on standard deviation. Okay, so the expected return of a portfolio, subtract it with the risk free return and divide the total extra return that you've got by the standard deviation of the portfolio. Standard deviation is nothing but the risk. So what we are doing is that the total returns that we generate, we subtract the risk-free returns. So what we get is the extra returns that we generate if we invest in a scheme. Okay, and if I divide that extra return with the total risk that I have taken, I get per unit risk how much return I've generated. So let's come back over here. Sharp ratio here will be 20%, which is the total returns I generated, subtract 4%, which is the risk free return, which means what, 16% extra return I've generated. Divide this by the total standard deviation. This standard deviation, this risk is for mutual fund A. What do I get? 3.2 something something, 3.2. Okay. So 3.2 is the Sharpe ratio of mutual fund A. What about the Sharpe ratio of mutual fund B? So 24% return minus 4%, which is 20%, means 20% extra returns I've got. Divide this by the risk that I've taken is equals to 2. Means mutual funds A Sharpe ratio is 3.2, mutual funds B Sharpe ratio is 2. This means that even though mutual fund A generated a greater return, my risk is better adjusted in mutual fund A. Why? Because see, what is Sharpe ratio? Per unit risk, how much return I've generated. Okay, so in mutual fund A, the thing is, I took less risk, but I took less risk. See, 5% risk. For mutual fund A, it's 5% risk. For mutual fund B, it's 10%. So here, it's 10% over here. Mutual fund B's risk was 10%, mutual fund A's risk is 5%. So here, even though I took lesser risk, but for per unit risk that took, I generated 3.2% return. Understand over here, we divided the total returns by the risk. So I got 3.2. 3.2% per unit risk I have generated. And here I generated 2% return on per unit risk that I took. Okay, there is some technical issues, but you are understanding the point, right? You're understanding the point. So mutual fund A is a better risk adjuster because even by taking lesser risk, I generated a greater, per unit risk value. I generated 3.2% per unit of risk that I've taken for mutual fund A. But for mutual fund B, I generated 2%. Meaning what? I took greater risk for mutual fund B, but I did not get as much return. Okay, so mutual fund B is a less, adjusted. Mutual fund A is a better adjusted return. Okay, better risk adjusted because for taking lesser risk, I generated greater return. More risk, I generated lesser return. If you so this is what Sharpe ratio tells you. Okay, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I will link have a link in my description box of a website which is really useful. Please read it. It will help you understand Sharpe ratio.